I want to welcome all of you to this panel discussion on sustaining a strong system of quality control to enhance audit quality. My name is Julie Bell Lindsay, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Audit Quality in Washington, D.C. We have esteemed panelists today, and I thought what we would do is just go down the line and have everybody introduce themselves.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Abe Dymond, the Chief of Staff for the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. I've been in my role for about 18 months now, and prior to that, I was special counsel to board member. I have to say, though, I'm required to say that anything I say today is my own and may not necessarily reflect the views of the board members, the PCAOB, or the staff of the PCAOB.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Heidi Schuetze. I'm the U.S. Chief Auditor with PwC. I actually spent 30 years in this area in our San Francisco office, focusing on large and smaller private and public companies, most recently in the engineering and construction industry. And about a year ago, my husband and our 3 kids moved to New Jersey. And we actually like New Jersey, but it's good to be back in San Francisco. So I lead our group, our auditing services, methodology, and tools group, and we're based out of Florham Park, New Jersey.
Heidi, maybe it's a short-term assignment. And come back here to the nice weather.
Exactly.
I'm Dan Sunderland. I'm Deloitte's chief auditor. I've been around for close to 38 years now. And like Heidi, I deal with methodology matters in the U.S. and around the world, and I've certainly had a lot of years in client service experience. And I talk to all of you guys an awful lot about your projects, so I'm glad to be here with you today.
And good afternoon. My name is Chris Smith. I'm the Global Head of Audit and Accounting for BDO. Been in that role for the last 3 years. Prior to that, in the national office here in the U.S., and like Dan and Heidi is dealing then and now with methodology. And like Abe, I need to give a disclaimer that what I may say doesn't necessarily represent the views of the PCAOB. Yeah.
And if you can't tell, Chris is going to be our source of fun this afternoon. So we do have 90 minutes today. We're going to hit several topics, but we do want to save about 15 minutes at the end for questions. So please be thinking of your questions, and we'll save some time for those. So just to tee up the discussion today, there's been a lot of discussion recently about firms' quality control processes, not just here in the U.S., but also internationally. And I know Abe is quite familiar that last November, the PCAOB Standing Advisory Group, or SAG as we refer to it, had a very robust discussion around the PCAOB standards and whether they need to be added to or refocused on like leadership and governance of firms and relooking at the quality control standards. And then earlier this year, the IAASB issued 3 different exposure drafts. I'm not going to repeat their very long, lengthy names, but we'll just refer to them as we refer to them as ISQM1, ISQM2, and ISA 220. And, just again, exposure drafts on updating quality control standards. So let's just kind of level set here and take stock of where we are from a regulatory perspective on systems of quality controls. So Abe, we're going to start with you. And as I mentioned, last November, the SAG had a very robust discussion where I think the consensus was the PCAOB should look to their current standards and think about adding a leadership or governance component to those standards. And also, I think the consensus was to leverage the experience of regulators around the world who are looking at these issues. And then just this past Friday, late breaking news, the PCAOB moved from their research agenda to their standard setting agenda, quality control measures and standards. So with all this as background, can you just give us an update on kind of what the current thinking is, what to expect, and the overall objective?
Sure. Well, thank you. So the new board, when it adopted its strategic plan last year, emphasized a couple of very important objectives to achieving its strategic priorities, one of which is continuous improvement in the quality of audit services, and the other is an emphasis on prevention in addition to detection and deterrence and remediation and compliance with auditing standards. we feel that the systems of quality control at the firms are very important to achieving and advancing those two objectives in particular, among other things. And so the concept of focusing on firm systems of quality control really is pervading a number of strategic initiatives at the board. One is our transformation of our inspections program. You may have heard a little bit about the changes to our inspection program. We have a more specific focus on quality controls and quality control processes through our inspection process. And we'll talk a little bit about that this afternoon. Another is outreach to stakeholders. So you mentioned our advisory group. We've engaged the advisory group and the firms and others in discussions around quality controls and the extent to which the standards and quality control systems help drive audit quality. And finally, the board is focused on its current research agenda and standard setting agenda. Our new chief auditor joined us about 6 months ago, and she's been working with the board to work through the projects that are on those agendas. And the staff and the board felt that it was very important to achieving those objectives of continuous improvement and prevention to advance the quality control project to a standard setting project. So as you said, on Friday, we moved the quality control standards project from the research agenda to the standard setting agenda. The objective really is to get early input from our stakeholders on whether and to what extent our standards need to be revised to be more effective. We think that getting that early input before we develop a very specific proposal will be helpful to be more efficient in the standard setting process. We're mindful of the work that the IAASB is doing, and we'll talk a little bit about that this afternoon. Some of the conversations that the board and the staff have been having with the firms, and we've had extensive conversations with the larger firms in particular about their systems and their progress that they've made, and our other inspections and oversight activities as well.
That's really helpful. And I think I should mention, if I have this right, that Megan Zietzman, who is the new chief auditor, she actually came from the IAASB. Is that correct? And so she had worked, I believe, worked on these standards at the IAASB level before joining the PCAOB.
It helps that she's intimately familiar with the project.
So Abe, you mentioned the PCAOB inspections process and quality control. Let's turn to Heidi and then Dan. Can you maybe provide some perspective on when you're talking to the board staff about some of the inspection results, you know, what discussions are you having that could help the PCAOB inform their process as they move forward?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the PCAOB is very interested in how we've developed and continued to enhance our system of quality control. We're providing a lot of information in response to the questions. We haven't, to this point, we've received a lot of questions, but haven't really seen themes come out of that. And we haven't, at this point, seen questions that we were not expecting. But I personally am looking forward to the standard setting in this area, but no themes that I've seen at this point, based on the questions.
And like Heidi, we've seen a great influx of questions relative to things. They range from things like tone at the top down type questions, to those that get more detailed about how do you manage independence, both from a personal perspective and a scope of services perspective. Or, for example, how do you identify exceptions and how do you resolve them? One of the things that I think we've learned as we've gone through this process is we're now under AS5. And all the questions that we're answering, just like we asked our clients about. So we're talking about explain your processes and your controls, identify the specific risks that those controls identify the gaps that might exist, and point out what systems exist that provide you information. So the cobbler now has to put shoes on his own kids.
Dan, maybe we could stay with you for just one more question. As I mentioned, the IAASB issued 3 exposure drafts earlier this year. Can you give us a sense of what's happening at the international level that may have prompted those exposure drafts? And if I don't think we do, but if we have any sense of the timing on final standards?
Audit firms come in all shapes and sizes. And we come in all shapes and sizes in the U.S., but around the world, they come in many more shapes and sizes. And so what they do is they serve different size clients. So you think about Scandinavia, and they're serving the dentist down the street or things like that. They perform different types of services. Some perform all sorts of audits. Some perform just sort of review services along the way. And they either operate in single jurisdictions or they operate in multiple jurisdictions. So the noise that was out there from an international perspective is the IWSB had put out ISQC1 a while ago, and I think there was a feeling that it was very prescriptive. And it was very prescriptive in that there were a lot of detailed things that people had to comply with that didn't fit into the business model that the folks had. And therefore, there was a demand in 2015 in a request for comment around trying to see how to address these things because folks wanted a scalable standard. So that's why they moved to an ISQM type situation where they talk about management as opposed to systems of quality control along the way. And I think that's very important to understand along the way. When you look at these standards, so you have the big one, which is the one on understanding a firm's system of quality controls. That's the granddaddy that's taking care of everything. The second one is like the PCAOB had done one on engagement quality reviews. It's on the micro level, and that's dealing with micro things. It doesn't vary that much from my perspective, at least from what we see from the PCAOB perspective. And the third one, which is a revision of the ISO 220, revolves around engagement management, again at the micro level. So you get the big granddaddy that takes care of the firm system of quality control, and then you drive down to lower levels in terms of managing engagements along the way. From a timing perspective, it's the IAASB. It takes longer. They go through a very long due process. And there are a lot of competing priorities out there. So I don't know exactly what we'll see here. It might be that PCO beats them to the punch, or hey, miracle of all miracles, everybody converges and decides to put out the same sort of standard along the way. Because remember, we're multinational firms. And it's very difficult, especially when you're trying to deal with systems of quality control, to get everybody on the same page all the time.
Any predictions, Abe, on if the PCAOB is going to beat the IAASB?
Well, I won't make a prediction on timing, but I did predict that this theme would come up during the discussion. So,
Chris, as the head of audit and accounting at BDO, and Dan kind of touched on a couple of these themes. The IAASB and their proposals are moving more from quality control to quality management. And then there are also the consistency concerns that Dan alluded to. Can you, moving in this direction, will firms have to do things under the IAASB standards that they're not currently doing now? And what would be the consistency between IAASB and PCAOB if the IAASB moves forward as proposed?
Sure. And while those are all very interesting questions, let me answer a question that I was ready to answer. No, just I might want to just pick up on one thing before I get into that. What's interesting, and I will eventually get into the ISQM, but globally, the IAASB, while they haven't finalized this particular piece of literature, there's been invitations to comment. Global regulators are conducting themselves, and they're actually already beginning the process of asking us and the other networks, what are you doing to prepare yourself for this particular standard? So what's interesting, while maybe it's another year out and then 2 years to adoption or something like that, the networks, the large networks, are now being held accountable towards the start to march towards compliance with this now. So I would just say, even though effective date might be out there in the future, implementation activities in all our networks, as I think we're going to tell you that today, have already started and have started in a robust way. Now, to the question I was asked, let me pick up on that. So here's a couple things as we've been working through this. And first, just so you know, when this first came around, there was a little bit of deliberation at the IAASB level about should they actually change the name of the thing from ISQC to ISQM. And at the time, I wasn't a big believer in, if you change the title, it changes much. As I've gone into deeper depths around what they're thinking. I now wholeheartedly subscribe to the use of management instead of control. And it really does drive things that we have to do differently going forward. Dan was saying some things that really rang true, that maybe the ISQCs, the way it was set up, it was a little bit static. We had 6 elements or so that we had to subscribe to. They were kind of monolithic, and I think what we would see is our firms would set those things up, and then they would kind of check boxes if they were just complying with them. We would set up an umbrella from a global level and kind of do the same thing. The big change that and I think this is the secret sauce of the word management now is, as Dan was saying, we have to first bring all those components together. So they all have to be integrated, and we have to manage them, and we have to start thinking about them together, and starting with from an objective level. So Dan also mentioned that as we have been grilling our clients over the last 15 years about COSO and the Audit Standard 5, we're now finding that the IAASB just borrowed very heavily from COSO, and they're saying to all the firms, you know, you start. What you have all these things you're trying to achieve. What are the objectives? And they've started in the standard in each of the 8 components. There's different objectives that we're supposed to actually document how our view of that objective or that component, what the objectives are. And we have to go beyond that, and then we have to say, okay, what are the risks? So for each objective and each component, what are the risks that could overcome or make that objective fail? And then finally, what is your response going to be to that risk? So what we have done that we previously hadn't done is done a whole bunch of risk mapping, which is an ongoing process, and we actually started this a while ago, and we're finding even before the standard comes in, we've already changed our risks. So by firm, we're thinking about risks. We're allocating out these tasks to each of the firms to do. We don't do it necessarily for the firms at a global level. And then we will have to start monitoring and thinking about, are the responses that firms have set up within themselves and then from us at a global level, is it sufficient to address the risk to achieve the objective, to make sure that quality reports are issued out of our shops?
So Abe, obviously the PCAOB is aware of what the IAASB is doing in this space. Can you tell us anything about, you know, how the board is looking at that, or what the interaction is between the two?
Yeah, so we're actively engaged with and monitoring what the IAASB is doing. So as you noted, Megan was previously on the IWSB on the board. She's also, in her current capacity, an observer to their advisory group, the CAG, and one of her senior staff members is an observer to the ISQM working group. So we're actively engaged with them through their process. We're also looking at the comment letters. So their comment period on their exposure draft closed, I think, in July, and we're closely monitoring the comments received and very eager to learn about how they respond to those as well. We have heard a little bit alluded to today, but we have heard and we're aware that firms may face some challenges if they have different requirements, quality control requirements. So we're very cognizant of that. We're thinking through that, and so as the IAASB works through its process, we'll be mindful of that and tracking that as well.
So basically the consistency issue, which I know the firms are very focused on. And if you look at the CAQ's comment letters on the IAASB standards, that's very much an issue of concern for the firms going forward. Yeah. Let's shift gears just a little bit and talk more about kind of the evolution of quality control theory and practice. And Chris, you know, we were talking about the IAASB ISQM1, which I guess, Dan, you referred to as the Big Daddy. Is that that? Okay. Granddaddy. Okay. It includes a new focus on information and communications, and in particular, firms establishing information systems and the need for two-way communications. How do you at BDO, how do you establish those processes? How do you communicate the message of quality control and audit quality down to your partners and staff?
Yeah, and maybe the way I would take this, and I'd be interested what Dan and Heidi have to say from a U.S. perspective. I'll just tell you from a global perspective what we're thinking about, and just to set the scene. So communications and information is one of the new components that we didn't have before and just stole or borrowed, whatever the term may be, from the COSO. And it does make sense to have this in the system of quality management that we have. What I would say, and if you go back and look at it, what the onus is now on from a firm level, that communications two-way, it's from the firm to the professionals and partners and back. It's from the firm up to the network level and back, and that's what I want to focus on. And then finally, there's all sorts of discussion in there about firm to stakeholders or external parties and back. And what we're focused on is, in candidly, is we've been thinking about this from a global level, that we have a ways to go in thinking about the communications that we do from a global level to any individual firm. So within BDO, there's 160 different firms. They all have to, not only deal with IAS and comply with the standards now, but they have to be ready for these when they do come into play. And we're thinking about the fact that heretofore, we at the global level may have done a nice job of collecting up information about what's going on in firms and what's going on across the network, but maybe not sharing it so much with each firm to help them undertake what they're doing. And we've even been struggling, at least over the last 3 years I've been at the global level, as firms have asked us about information about what's going on elsewhere. We have struggled to be very transparent in certain of our communications inside because of privacy and right to know and client situations. So from a global level, we are working through how to make sure that our firms, each of our firms in our network, have the information that they need about what's going on in quality across BDO. But be curious what the experiences of others have been.
I'll let Dan go.
Okay. Information systems is an interesting topic because information systems, unfortunately, I think many firms, their information systems are Excel spreadsheets. I mean, everybody has this conception that there's this sophisticated information system that exists out there that doesn't. And as Chris indicated, what you're trying to do is manage a very large database with an awful lot of information and be able to say what should go out and what shouldn't go out and what should be shared and what shouldn't be shared. So as we all tend to our own shops, we do have to concentrate on making sure we do have those information systems in play all the time. Communication also, as Chris said, is just imperative, and it's important that everybody knows what's going on, but you have to, there's so much stuff that goes on around the world that you don't want to get out yet because you don't know exactly what the truth is around it. So you're going to have to monitor that and decide who should know what when, all within the system of quality control, because you want to make sure everybody's aware that if there's a problem in your firm in Malaysia or Indonesia or something like that, the teams that are relying on things from Malaysia and Indonesia better know about it pretty darn quick. So all this plays in together along the way.
Yeah, the only thing, I don't know if this is additive, but just kind of supports what Dan and Chris said, is that we're very careful we want to balance transparency with need to know and confidentiality. So it's a balance. Like, we have to decide exactly when we're going to tell everybody about the various things going on in different jurisdictions. So it's just a tricky timing issue.
And I am relieved to now hear that perhaps Deloitte is using Excel spreadsheets, because I thought we were the only ones. Yeah.
We're
But
way beyond Excel
yeah.
spreadsheets at PwC.
Yeah. But if you think about
What's
it,
Excel? That's like Lotus 1, 2, 3, right?
yeah. But what's interesting, and I came into this maybe really underestimating the information part, because what the standard is telling us we have to do is, for each of these components, we have to be collecting up this information in a way that we can gather it, assess it, distill it, communicate it out. And Excel, unless there's someone's got the magic macro, it just can't handle that. So what we are doing right now is we're going through vendor selection. So, a new system that we need at a global level that integrates in with what the firms are doing, and it's just turned into a major information overhaul project to make sure we're ready for this.
And I just want to follow on one thing Chris said earlier, and I know Heidi shares this probably, is that de facto, the standard is being adopted right now. I mean, we're using it as our framework because there's no comprehensive framework that exists out there.
Right.
So de facto, we're dealing with it.
Agree, same.
Yeah.
But we don't use spreadsheets, Excel.
I think I'll come work there. I'm retired, so I can go work with you guys. I'll be a system developer.
Taking a note down for a project, Excel spreadsheets.
Heidi, you mentioned transparency a little while ago. Firms have been doing audit quality reports for 10 plus years or so, and I didn't appreciate until I took this job, there's also transparency reports that firms are doing that have sometimes been required by law or regulation in various jurisdictions. Can you give us a sense of what's included in those types of reports and how much detail a reader would have around a firm's quality control processes by reading the reports?
Yeah, sure, happy to. So, as Margot mentioned, that there's a transparency report. It's very transparent. No, but it's really prescribed by the EU's directive on statutory audits. So it's more prescriptive in terms of what gets included in it. Very compliance focused, but there's a lot of good information in there. So it covers things like leadership and accountability, independence, partner rotation, retention, learning and education, which is an important piece, audit methodology, and root cause analysis. So it covers a lot of key aspects of our system of quality control. Contrast that to the quality report, and the quality report really represents what we believe drives audit quality. So it's not prescriptive, it's based on what we think are the drivers. So it includes a lot of data points and metrics, a lot of information, but just to give you a flavor, we'll have metrics on staff turnover, because that obviously has a voluntary turnover. That has an impact on audit quality. So it'll be turnover at the partner level, manager level, and associate level. We also include mandated learning and education hours by level as well, because that's one of the things we think is an important metric. And I'm only giving you a snapshot of what we cover. There's a lot in the report, but also overtime hours by level. We talk about our leadership and governance structure. We talk about some of the key elements of our system of quality control, and as well as the results of our internal evaluation of our system of quality control. And our most recent one indicated that it was designed appropriately and operating effectively. Also talks about our monitoring process, about our internal inspections, how we monitor quality, how we adjust when we see quality type challenges, that sort of thing. So I guess in a nutshell, the transparency report, while including a lot of relevant information on quality, is more prescribed, and then the quality report is based on what we believe drives audit quality.
Dan, I was going to say, Dan or Chris,
And
you
it's
want
not
to
in
add?
Excel. Just kidding, sorry.
And I would bet that if you looked at all the requests you've gotten from the PCAOB right now, Heidi, they probably on 3 or 4 of them have actually included the audit quality
Yes,
report in there.
yes.
Because it covers so many
It
different
covers so many
things.
things, yep.
So it is all inclusive. And I was just doing that today.
It's the big granddaddy, or what do we call it? I
Putting
don't
the
know.
granddaddy here, but again, I just today we were putting it in 3 responses to say, go to this and take excerpts from it. So it really is a treasure trove of information.
And we all kind of compare our quality reports to others.
Yeah, this is really good.
Yours is good, too.
I'm glad we established that.
Love it.
Question for Dan. What steps are firms taking to introduce or enhance the rigor around processes and controls over audit quality at the firm level?
Well, again, we got to deal with our own AS5 now. So we're going through this process of creating process flow diagrams for everything we did. So back in 2010, 2011, we put things together. They were in narratives. And as all we know, narratives are sometimes okay, but process flow diagrams are probably better along the way. We have to distinguish between what a process is and what a control is. And if you go back and look at our documentation in 2010, 2011, we didn't do a very good job about distinguishing those two things. And one thing I think I'm finding as we go through things is that you go through the same thing again and again. You have the same sort of control that acts the same way. So as we pull these things together, I think they're going to overlap a great deal. We do have to understand the information that's used in the performance of the control. IUC comes up all the time. And of course, if you have IUC, what do you have to do? You have to understand that the system generating that is a legit system and has GITCs in place. So we have this whole process we're going through. Now think about this in context of how do you even organize this? And this is where we go back to the granddaddy. And the granddaddy has a little house in it. And it has 7 different areas. It has governance and leadership, firm's ethical risk assessment process, relevant ethical requirements, acceptance and continuance, engagement performance, resources, information communications, and monitoring and mediation. And we've taken those broad 8 topics, or 7 topics that exist there, and try and create an outline around that. And then try and parse that into who's responsible for each of these things and go through these process flow diagrams that are taking a great deal of time. And these are happening at the same time with the PCAOB requests on their information about the ISQC. And so hopefully we're baking this all in and we're getting feedback along the way. And we overlap a great deal.
Yeah, I was going to say, just on that, we're going through, at the firm level, a lot of the same things, and it is kind of interesting that we are doing to ourselves what we did to our clients. So we have named, and how much fun is that? So we have named control owners and process owners, and we're handing them, this is what we think happens. Would you confirm this or, correct it? Pick out the controls. The tricky part, right, and we get a little bit of pushback on that, right? And then we have to explain what we're trying to do, so that's effective two-way communication. It's probably more effective when they tell me they're not going to do it, and it's up to me, but be that as it may. But we are going through this. My joke made me forget my point. I'll come back to it. We're going through it. We're actually rethinking what happens. We're actually also finding out that as we ask them to tell us how their process works, we're also starting to ask them what they think the risks are that might undo what they're trying to do. And that's one where we are doing a more healthy step back, so we're not letting them do so much self-inspection or self-reflection about it, because we're finding that oftentimes they're coming short on how many risks, or are they really coming at the real risks that are preventing adequate resources or changes in personnel or whatever it might be. So we are, while we ask the process owners to identify what's going on, we're being a little bit more heavy-handed in thinking about risks.
So Abe, we've been hearing about how the firms are evolving on quality control and audit quality. Can you comment on kind of what the PCAOB is seeing from an evolution in audit quality?
So as you indicate, you can see some of the evolution that's taking place now, but from a broader perspective, maybe historical perspective from the PCAOB, if you think back 15 years ago, our process from an inspections approach really involved a two-part approach. One was to inspect individual engagements, and that was the vast majority of our effort in our inspections. And we also looked at certain firm management and monitoring activities and certain elements of quality control. Under our standards, many of our quality control issues that we identify were inferred from those engagement deficiencies or engagement inspections. And we occasionally had some that we'd identified through the quality control inspection process. And we identified a significant number of engagement deficiencies, which drove a lot of focus on kind of process and policies-based approaches to quality management. And we've seen significant investments by the firms and significant improvements in those areas. As we've begun to shift focus a little bit more on quality controls and tone at the top and leadership and monitoring activities, we've seen a lot of investment in management in that area as well. So the board is focused on effective implementation of its standards, and so we focus on that pretty intently during inspections process. But we do see a lot of effort in the firms at improving their processes to ensure the compliance with the standards.
So, oh, I'm sorry, Chris, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to pick up on a point, and maybe we touched on it already. So what I think what informed the IAASB in many regards were regulatory and inspection results from around the world, right? Mm-hmm. So they've received the feedback that has been, in my view, very well baked into the proposed standard that we're dealing with right now. The one thing that I think is critically important for the PCAOB to take into account is that process. And the one thing is I see the world converging in other areas, whether it's the accounting or the audit. It just makes all the sense in the world from a quality standpoint, from a public interest standpoint, that we see as much convergence as possible in the whole notion of what's the quality environment. And that, I would just say, even as when I put my U.S. hat back on, if we're really thinking about establishing high quality in the public interest for U.S. issuers, you want to make sure that quality is consistent across the firms that are conducting those audits across the globe, right? And sometimes if we end up in different spots in 2 or 3 years' time, that may cause more confusion around what is the meaning of quality, how do you get there, how do you... All right, hey Siri. All right, Siri agrees with me. All right, so anyway, it is one of these things where I really would hope that the board is looking at some of the really great work that's already been done by the IAASB in reaching the point that they got to.
I think that's helpful, Chris, if you don't mind. And we are very mindful of that. Just a couple of other thoughts. As I think Dan alluded to, the variety of firms around the world is very important. It also applies to our domestic audit firms as well. So there's a wide variety within the U.S. So we're talking with the larger firms here that managing large networks. We have very small firms, so we have to be mindful of tailoring an approach that can be scaled to a small firm all the way up to a large global network. And we do have some unique requirements under our U.S. securities laws and regulations, so we have to be mindful of those as well. So we're working through and thinking through all those issues. But I take your point.
And I think the scaling's so important because it's one standard. It's not 5 different standards, it's one standard. And as we go through this process, we can get the IWSB and the PCAOB to converge to some degree, hopefully relative to this. The next thing to do is to get the 95 regulators around the world to decide that they're going to interpret this in the same fashion. And that's a big issue that we all have to confront, and hopefully that gets confronted as we deal with things, because it's something I'm sure drives Chris crazy every single day in your global role.
Yeah. So, and in fact, we've probably been remiss in not mentioning scalability has driven the IAASB in their thinking around this, and they use scalable, ad nauseum throughout the standard, and they've allowed for firms that use Excel spreadsheets to from the biggest to the smallest, and it's the manner. Yeah, yeah, all right. It's the manner in which it can be applied that it's a framework, and if you are taking into account the 8 elements and you're thinking about the objectives, it doesn't matter if you're the largest organization doing audits around the globe or a small local firm. it's scalable. And that's what we're finding, I'm sure your organizations, is we have very small firms in our network, and we're trying to make sure that they take this thing up, that quality there is consistent with quality in our more mature, larger firms. And we are finding that, at least on the first pass from a global level, we think it is scalable.
So I want to keep us on schedule, but before we leave this topic, I do want to ask, given the audience that we have, is there any academic research that you all think, and I'm opening up to anybody on the panel, that you all think would be helpful as we go forward in this process?
Do you want me to start? You're probably
Sure.
going to make fun of whatever I said. No.
No.
No. I was thinking about what, just as I've been talking to folks about research and stuff and what would be helpful. I think I think there could be a lot of useful academic research. With that said, getting the data from the firms to do that research, I think is going to be the biggest challenge. I was thinking about, like the firm's acceptance and continuance process. That could kind of be a useful thing to look at. But then I know we wouldn't want to provide all that information. And then I thought about, could there be an example where there's another system of quality control outside of public accounting that can somehow be analogized to ours? But I don't have a silver bullet. I don't know about you, Dan. What?
No, those are
And
good.
Chris?
Those are good theoretical thoughts. I was contemplating this in terms of what publicly available information's out there. Part 1 comments are the only thing that's publicly available. What the PCAOB's asked us to do this year, and I looked at Heidi and Chris also, is that in addition to responding to their comments, they want us to identify the elements of our quality control that should be operative or applicable to this. So one of the things that you could do in looking at those Part 1 comments is hypothesize what elements of a good quality control environment might be able to detect these things. And you're going to fall back on methodology a lot of the time, but I start walking the tightrope because sometimes I want to say it's national based and methodology issues that are causing the problem. But on the other hand, I want to say it's the engagement team that didn't execute the right way. And you're balancing that. So I don't know how exactly to go about this, and it would be a very collaborative type discussion on it. But there's a lot of things out there. And I like Heidi's idea about some of the theory around it.
Let's switch gears, and we mentioned that the IWSB is focused on and the SAG at the PCAOB was very focused on leadership and governance. And start with you, Heidi, on this one. Obviously you mentioned the audit quality reports and the transparency reports, and the firm commitment to audit quality and quality control. When you think about Tim Ryan, CEO of PwC, what steps do you take internally at the firm to convey his leadership and his thinking on the importance of these topics down and back up again? How does that work?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things, so I'll just touch on a few of them. But Tim sets a tone at the top that audit quality is foundational to our strategy, and it's actually in our strategy. He has regular partner webcasts for all the partners, but a big piece of that is focused on audit quality. There's a large group of partners that we call it assurance partners or audit partners. And then below Tim, his leadership team drives it as well. So our assurance leader is now Wes Bricker. He has periodic calls with the assurance partners. He sets the tone on quality. There's always, I will frequently give an update on quality during those calls. And so that goes all the way down. I was going to say just what I started to do in my role is whenever we roll out something to the practice, whether it be a new policy or new guidance or a new methodology, I link it into the strategy. So I always include language similar to this where I'll, say what the topic is, and then I'll say it supports our goal of becoming the most relevant assurance practice by further supporting our teams in execution of quality independent audits, which is the foundation of our audit strategy. So I always try to tie it back to the strategy of audit, with audit quality being the foundation of the strategy. We also kind of monitor how our people are hearing, like how they're hearing the messages from leadership. So we do a global people survey, which I'm sure all the other firms do. But one of the questions relates to, it's this: does the leader's messaging convey the importance of quality to success of the firm, specifically audit quality? So we monitor it that way, and if we see trends, we always look for meaningful changes in that percentage, and then that'll drive our behaviors. We also include specific quality goals in all the audit partners' partner plans. Those are due tomorrow, by the way, at midnight
Can I
Eastern
have an
time.
extension?
What are you doing
There's
here?
no
on the-
extensions, no extensions. But no, it's very,
System is down.
it's very specific. So it's taking what we're trying to drive from a quality perspective and putting it in plans, because if it's in your plan, you're more like, you're going to do it more. And then we also have quarterly audit webcasts from my group. They're between 60 and 90 minutes. 2 of them in the year are mandatory. The others, we get pretty much close. I mean, even the ones that aren't mandated, probably 90% of the people participate. But there we drive the quality messages, and we have reminders, and we talk about new guidance and that sort of thing. The other thing I just want to mention is kind of ending it on a not positive note, but we also, if there's if a partner has a non-compliant audit, meaning it's a deficient audit, they get a compensation charge. And I don't know how it is at Deloitte and the other firms, but the partners that I talk to that have a non-compliant audit, they're not concerned about the compensation charge. It's a one-time thing, and it's significant, but they're more concerned about the shame of having a non-compliant audit. So I'm sure that's the same everywhere.
I think that's true, Heidi. I mean, people care about what they do, and everybody's really proud of what they do, and it hurts.
Yeah, like they don't wake up and say, I'm going to mess up the audit, so they're trying, but anyway.
Chris or Dan, anything you wanted to add about tone at the top at your respective firms and steps that you take?
Yeah, maybe I was just looking at my notes just to see everything Heidi said we do. When I think about this, tone at the top just speaks right to culture, and when I think culture, it's action speak louder than words. So then, both in the proposed standard itself and elsewhere, speaks to actions that the leaders and those charged with governance can take to actually make sure the environment supports quality. So we are focused on those, and I was just looking, as you were mentioning, things that happen at PwC here in the U.S. We are baking that into, it happens at BDO in the U.S. It doesn't actually happen consistently around the world. So some of these notions around linking quality to compensation adjustments for partners, that's a very foreign topic in some places. So we're actually beginning the education process of talking to firms about why that's important, how it might be done, how partners do adjust to that, and ultimately it does come to pride. The other thing that to me speaks to actions being louder than words is, in the standard actually speaks to this, is commitment to the resources. So just the people that do this, the dollars, the technology. So, it is something that, for very selfish reasons, I keep saying to my boss, hey, if you're not giving me the dollars or the people, so I don't have to use Excel, then that's going to look very poorly on you and ultimately on me. So it's a name and shame at BDO.
And the only other thing I'd add is, timely or untimely, we got another information request from PCAOB on this. And as Heidi describes it, the tone at the top relative to the audit practice is a big deal. But the tone at the top extends beyond the audit practice into tax, consulting, the advisory services that we provide, because those folks can screw up independence, both from a personal perspective or a scope of service perspective. It's snap of your fingers.
And how, yeah.
Yeah, and so it is a message that has to be driven down, and I think, as Heidi mentioned, you have to decide how to do it. It can be CO sometimes. Sometimes you have to go through in a regional network. Sometimes you have to go through a functional network. It's how we're going to get responses back from folks along the way. And Heidi pointed again to getting to see how people react to things, because it's always how do you monitor a reaction? And apart from saying, well, we didn't have any inspection comments, there's different things you have to do to do it. It's hard to do. It's always the prove it. We're asking our clients to prove it. We got to prove this now. That's hard to do.
Dan, continuing in that vein, firms do have systems or processes and procedures in place to monitor quality control and their quality objectives. Given that quality objectives are largely inviolate, what processes, procedures, and controls are more likely to fail? And would the failure be driven more by internal or external factors?
Well, it's interesting because we all go through a root cause analysis on things. And you try and get things thematic relative to it. And you always end up being on 2 or 3 specific things. Was a methodology failure? And that tends to be an internal type thing. And did you fail to put guidance out there? Or did the team fail to see what you wrote? And you start to get on a very narrow rope at that point in time because the standards are principles-based. You can provide guidance to a certain level, but there's some level you can't provide guidance to. You can't get every single scenario. So at what point in time are the faults at the firm-based level as opposed to the engagement team level? And we just go around and around about, is it how we train? So one is how they execute. Next one is how you get trained. And as we talk about it again and again, how do you measure whether they absorb what they got trained in? Well, you can have an assessment when they finish the course. Well, you do that right away. You get 10 multiple choice questions. And if you fail, you get to do it again until you get it right. But how do you monitor continually that people are actually absorbing the training and applying the general principles you're trying to get across to them as opposed to the very specific things that are out there? So I would say, Julie, that a lot of it is internal as opposed to external factors. External factors might arise. If external factors arise, it can again be broad firm or specific engagement related. If you had tariffs going on, trade wars with China, firm probably has to put out guidance relative to it. Engagement team has to analyze it in their own facts and circumstances. It's a mix that you're having.
Yeah, and I just want to add one thing to that. You talked about how you monitor and make sure people are understanding the methodology and that whatnot. What we started to do is get feedback from, because there's obviously a wide gap between like my generation and the generation of people when they join the firm, and how they like to learn, how they like to process things. So, we had been putting out, we call them audit advisors, but it's, some of them have been quite lengthy, like 25, 30 pages. And so we wanted to, when we try to measure, are people really reading this? Are they understanding it? What can we do to get it where they understand it? So we're experimenting now with just putting out, because the feedback we got is they don't want to read all that stuff as much. They prefer, sometimes podcasts and things like that. So it's a different way of bringing our message to the practice. So we started doing kind of shorter snippets, like kind of quick hit items, but more of them and more often, so that we're hoping it's more digestible. So we keep trying. My point is, you keep trying to find the best way to drive the quality message to the people in the field working with clients, and you have to continually adjust to make it effective.
And this just brings up an interesting topic for all of you, is learning, and how we monitor learning.
yeah.
And so things that you do can teach us how to better
Yes.
do this.
So, Abe, we've been talking a lot about leadership and governance. And in the course of the PCAOB's project on quality control, my understanding is currently the PCAOB standard does not include leadership and governance as part of the 5 different components. But how is the PCAOB considering this as they move forward?
Well, the concept of leadership and governance obviously are very important to quality control and management of quality control. I think you've heard from Dan and others that we do address aspects of leadership and governance in our inspections process. And we've had many comments, we've shared many comments and observations with the firms about discrete aspects of leadership and governance, whether it's incentive systems, accountability systems, messaging, tone at the top, those kinds of things. we do address that and discuss that with the firms during the inspection process. So the question really, if for our standard setting project is, although there are limited references to aspects of leadership and governance in the standards, should it be more explicitly called out? Maybe something along the lines of the way the IAASB is doing. So we're studying that, we're mindful of that, and we'll continue to evaluate whether and how to do that.
So it could be memorializing kind of what's currently somewhat the practice.
Could be
yeah.
one approach.
Yeah. Let's now shift gears to how do we monitor and remediate quality control deficiencies. And we kind of started to talk about this a little bit with the root cause analyses, that discussion that we were having. I guess I'll open it up to the three firms. Maybe Heidi, to start with you. Okay. Can you explain how your firms perform root cause analyses? And, this is a result of your own monitoring processes and internal inspections. Any themes that have resulted from those analyses?
Sure, yeah. So the way we do our root cause analysis, we look at audits that have deficiencies and those that do not have deficiencies. From both internal inspections that PwC does, where we do our own monitoring, as well as PCAOB inspections. We have a team independent from the engagement team, obviously, do that review. And we look at potential causal factors. So we have a lot of different data points. I'll name some of them, but we look at, and we also perform interviews with the engagement team. We review work papers to get a better sense. So we look at the hours incurred on the engagement. We also look at hours incurred by level. So partner, what percentage is partner, manager, et cetera. We look at whether the key engagement team members are from the same geographic area. We look at the number of years the key engagement team members were on that particular engagement to see if that comes into play. We also look at the number of other audits that a particular partner works on. So we want to see if maybe they have too much on their plate, that type of thing. And then we look at whether or not that audit was subject to our pre-issuance reviews that we do. We have a pre-issuance program that before the audit opinion gets released, we don't do 100% of them, but we will target engagement teams to do our own pre-issuance review. And we also look at the timing and the phasing of work. So I will not remember the statistic off the top of my head, but one of the things we did find in the root cause analysis several years ago is that if something like 65% of the work, and again, don't quote me on these numbers because it's off the top of my head, if 65% of the hours were not incurred before the end of the year, like before December, and it's a December 31st year end, that was potentially indicative of, where you could have an audit challenge, I guess. So we do all that. I mean, that's one of the themes we've seen. The other theme had been around how we audit review controls. So we saw that in that case, and I think you call it controls with the review element. But in that case, we put out more enhanced guidance on review controls, how to test them. We enhanced our template, that sort of thing. And yes, it was on Excel at the time. So.
I think ours is still on Excel.
I think ours is too, but I didn't want to admit that. Okay.
Dan,
Where do you go?
did you have anything to add to?
I think Heidi did a good job. I think the one thing that she mentioned, because we do look at correlation and what are determinant factors. And we've tried to do this over the last 10 years or so. And what are the only things that really correlate? Timing. And I think it's either 60-40 or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's leverage. Okay? And if you don't have a lot of if you have too many staff and not enough senior people involved, that's a big deal. Everything else, the analysis tends to fall apart. You just can't establish correlation. But the same idea that Heidi discussed, you go through this remediation process, you have a third party doing those root cause analyses along the way, and go from there, and you try and pull them all together.
So I would add a couple things. So how we do it at BDO is at the end of every engagement, 5 people go into a room. They all agree that it was my fault, and then they come out
That's good.
That's a joke.
Is it,
We do all the same. I make jokes.
do you document on a spreadsheet?
Well, what's interesting is I was just listening. So you're already starting to speak about indicators and milestones and stuff, and which we use. What's interesting to me about this, maybe to get away from the indicators for a second, and just to the standard itself, there is this high degree of emphasis on monitoring, and one of the refresh and resets that they did here was to say, as you've both indicated, you do real-time monitoring or real-time inspection or real-time coaching, whatever the case may be. And that's probably one of the things that's important to understand right now is all of our firms have created technology now that teams use to conduct the audit, pull the audit together. I think all of our technologies or tools allow remote people or people outside of the audit room to actually see what's going on. So over the last 10 years, as the technology has improved, how we monitor and we think about monitoring and how we think about getting high quality has changed from just doing the post-mortem after a job's done, what happened, what didn't go right, to most of us are now thinking about how do we proactively do this. So it's either through the audit quality indicators and thinking about time spent or just having access to files. So the standard is actually now taking account of that. And the other thing to me, which I think is a really good thing, so we right now we're somewhat beholden to, there's words in the international standard that says, you have to look at one completed engagement for each partner in a cycle. What's interesting is that wording has carried over. However, the cycle is allowed more interpretation. So to the extent someone's been subject to a real-time inspection or some of the other things, that will actually help us be more focus on the risk of that. The other thing now I was just going to say about monitoring, that as we have thought about monitoring in the current standard right now, we're always talking about the engagement. So what happened at the engagement? ISQM, as proposed, is very clear that we are to be monitoring all these elements. So we're supposed to be monitoring leadership, communications, all the different areas that we've thought about, and trying to find when things don't go right there as well. So that is going to be a very interesting change management thing. So we're not only looking at the engagement teams, we're looking at leadership to make sure stuff is happening as advertised.
And I think that monitoring point that Chris brings up is important, because it can't be a checklist mentality. And you start to go through these things and people just start to say, well, did somebody sign off on that? Well, we've told our clients that a sign-off doesn't indicate a controls operative. What do you do to prove these things are happening? So we're all going through this where we are moving off Excel spreadsheets into digitization and trying to figure out what things you can actually draw from those working papers that do allow you to understand what's happening within that engagement. That is really critical to what's going on in that engagement, as opposed to somebody signed off on this.
So we talked about the root cause analyses and looking at where the deficiencies have occurred. Let's switch now to how do you remediate those deficiencies? Is it a simple matter of additional learning and development, the application of the methodology and the standards? And maybe we could start at the end of the table, Chris, and come back this way. But how do firms approach remediation issues?
So I'll address it from a global level and from what happens when we, so just so you're aware, one of the things that all the global networks do is we send in teams to look at what's going on inside of countries. So it kind of works like a regulatory inspection or a firm inspection or peer review. It's all about the same. What we do when we send in an inspector, and candidly, we still are a little bit more focused on when things don't go right. So we're not necessarily thinking about when things go right. So it's always the negative. But what we do is we ask the people that do the inspections to actually do some level of query. We used to actually, when we'd find a finding inside of any firm, we'd ask the firm to fill out the form, why did this happen? And it was rather superficial. We've now actually come up with 50 different things that it could be that we're trying to actually score what's going on. We found even though I think it just always comes down to one of three things, we've actually...
If there was an EQR breakdown, then they need to send a reminder to EQR reviewers. Or if there was an inadequate supervision or lack of professional skepticism, then they would remind people that maybe they just didn't focus on it enough. But what really was the cause? Was it lack of time, lack of resources, lack of training, lack of competence, a breakdown in methodology? To really drive down into what's the key driver of the particular problem or deficiency. So I think that's really where one of the good practices that we've seen. We've also seen on a broader level significant investment in those kinds of programs. And we've seen some firms even begin to dedicate resources to quantitative aspects, so using audit quality indicators or other statistical analyses to identify causes and even remedial steps as well.
Anything to add from the panel?
AQIs are a great topic for anybody to explore. They're
From a
really
research
hard.
They're very hard.
Well, I think before we go any further, we can certainly stop and open the floor to any questions. Okay, we already have two questions. I will say we don't have microphones, so if you say, and then I'll repeat the question for purposes of. Oh.
We have over 30 years of behavioral audit research, okay, that suggests what the drivers of negative quality events are, and also what the best remediation strategies might be to mitigate those negative quality events. So in thinking about your root cause analysis procedures, your findings, and your remediation strategies, how can we help you capitalize on that research, and what can we research going forward that would also help inform your efforts?
Can I
Yeah,
jump?
you please.
Can I jump? Well, Chris, I guess
stumped me.
for one thing, we appreciate the synthesis of that research that's been done in the past. So any additional synthesis work that the academics can do to garner those insights would be very helpful to us as policymakers. But in actual practice, I'll defer to the firms to see if they have thoughts.
But I think, Chris, bring it on.
Can I see it?
Was there a synthesis that had gone out in Journal of Account?
No, there is currently no synthesis on root cause analysis. I'm working on one, but
That would be good.
I know, but there's got to be things that going forward. I'm sure there are things that are not in the last 30 years of behavioral audit research that going forward perhaps might be great focus areas for us that will help inform your efforts, because I know the firms are struggling with root cause analysis. It's not easy unless you happen to specialize in behavioral audit research, because the context is unique.
I think the only thing I'd start with, and I don't, and this is just off the top of my head, is go to the new standard that isn't a standard yet, but they have the house, and it has the 8 elements there. And sort of parse through that and see if there's certain behavioral elements that ring true and that you can dig up the research on or start to do research on. Because we certainly can dialogue, and I think we're all open to having a lot of dialogue, because the more the merrier on this thing.
I'm very intrigued by the research.
Yes.
Unlike Chris, I don't have any prepared notes. I have a far more basic question. Before I can even appreciate root cause analysis, I need to get a much better feel for even what the frequency of deficient audits is, and how to get arms around that. And obviously, one place to start would be the PCAOB inspection process, so we can all see part 1 with the client name redacted. But that's just a sample, and I would pretty clearly guesstimate that if I just took the percentage of deficient audits divided by the number of sample audits and applied that percentage to the total firm's clients, that the firms would argue that's a gross overestimation of the number of deficient audits. I'll tell you what academics use, which is visible signals like a restatement as a signal of but there's also the internal inspection process, and that's obviously something confidential, something that's not publicly visible. But I don't even have a ballpark guess as to if I wanted to estimate the frequency of deficient audits, and I started, let's say, with the number of deficient, as identified by the PCAOB audits through the inspection process, and then I'm trying to guess, all right, how much should I add to that if I'm trying to factor in the internal inspection findings? Should I be adding a small number or?
Well, and I was just, can I say one thing, just super quick? And I don't know about everybody else's quality report, but our quality report has our compliance rate for our internal inspections. So that is in ours. And it's a higher inspection and higher compliance rate.
And I would say that is a publicly visible report.
Yeah, it's on our website.
I was going to say, it's on your website.
It's on our
isn't it?
website, yeah. Do you have the same?
I don't know.
Have you read it? Have you read your?
Yeah, I've read it, but I don't know if I know.
But Dan, I mean, it is, you put yours on the website too. It's a
Oh, yeah,
public
ours on the
document, yeah.
website. I don't know if we have the internal inspection findings there. One of the things that we do is we do reconcile what the rate is from PCAOB perspective to the ones we have, and that's part of our analysis of that we deal with.
But if the internal rate is, and I will admit to my embarrassment, I didn't know this, and I'll go dig it up, but if that's public record, obviously with names redacted, that's still a huge start, and so that would be very, very helpful. So I'm thinking of trying to get publicly available information that can be used for comparison and monitoring and all that. I guess if I were a regulator, that'd be the first thing I'd start with, at least document those frequencies.
So it's a whole separate topic for us. So you can go to our website and see some speeches that we made recently on the transformation that we're making to our inspection program. So obviously, the rates, the results that we see in the inspections now are not you can extrapolate those across the firm because of our selection methodology. But we are working intently on evaluating how we select, how we communicate the findings and the results and what those mean. And so hopefully in the near future, you'll start to see differences in how we report those findings, both in the individual firm reports and in other reports. So it can provide some more meaning for the markets about the individual findings.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, like, the way the PCAOB does their selections versus the way we select, we do a much larger number, but like, every partner has to be inspected every, 4 years. And so it's not as, I think the PCAOB is more risk-based in terms of an algorithm and identifying what engagements to select, whereas ours is risk-based as well, but it also, we have to meet the every 4-year requirement. So it's not quite apples to apples.
We actually have a mixture right now in the larger firm and selection process. It's largely risk-based, but there's a small subset of randomly selected.
yeah.
But it's not large enough to be a valid
Be
sample
meaningful.
size. So, and we don't distinguish those in the reports right now. We're
And
thinking
again,
about
as you
what it would
guys
be.
analyze those things, I think the themes are the ones you want to draw out to see if there's a consistent theme that emerges. And usually themes are fairly consistent when all said and done.
Any other questions?
Over here.
Yes.
You all talked about the tone at the top as it related to audit quality and the emphasis that's put on that. But the tone at the top includes, at least in my experience, a lot of messages on a lot of different things. So how do you deal with the issue of mixed messages? And, for example, when you ask people, is audit quality, is that emphasized? Well, you ask, how does audit quality compare in importance to growth, profits, efficiency, developing people, all those other things about which there are messages, and important messages in the tone at the top.
I'll go first. I mean, we deal with it continually. You're speaking to one of the challenges we're all dealing with is the different messages that are sent out either directly or indirectly or explicitly or implicitly that are received by partners and staff, and they are always trying to sift through which ones do they have to respond to. So we are always monitoring not only what's being said, but what's being received. And I know Heidi was speaking to the fact they try to, I think we all try to make sure quality is tied to even those messages around growth and profitability. And but that's difficult work, right? So it's something that we just are on all the time. And to figure out if there's an imbalance, not only do we look at like what are the messages written, the webcasts, all that stuff, but then we also do surveys of the recipients, what is getting through, and where we see that, there's an imbalance and quality's not the heavier end of that scale. We try to adjust and work with the people sending the messages.
I think from our perspective too, it is we try and incorporate quality in every single message that we send out. And I guess in my back pocket, I always have that quality card that I can pull if it sounds like messaging are going one way or another. And fortunately, I think tone of the top at all the firms are quality is foundational to everything we do. It's not just in the audit practice, it's everywhere else that we have to make sure that we have those qualities. So wrapped into profitability is the fact to be profitable, you have to have quality, because without the quality, you're not going to have the clients, et cetera, et cetera. So but it is an everyday struggle, an everyday discussion to make sure it's top of mind.
Yeah, and I mean, it's easy to say quality's number one, like anyone can say that, right? But we have to really behave like it's number one. And so it's a challenge though. And people, I think our behaviors and the tone at the top, starting with our senior partner, Tim Ryan, is that quality is number one, and his behaviors support that. But then some partners in the practice may hear messages differently. So we're constantly, and then we measure how people are hearing the message through our Global People Survey. We have specific questions on that area. So it's a challenge, though. That was a very good question.
Yeah.
And to Heidi's
Yeah.
point, our inspectors, when we're inspecting, we do look at the actions and the words of the senior leadership at the top of the firm, but we also, our inspectors are attuned to the tone at the middle and the tone throughout, and make sure those messages and behaviors are aligned. And so we've commented to some firms on that as well.
And we get called on them if they're
We
inconsistent.
do, yeah.
Yeah, and through that process, I think all of us have taken steps to address that middle management or an office managing partner or a regional partner that may have been countermanding, the greatest messages from on high were getting intercepted and said, nope, we are focused on how your office is growing. Those people are now, when we think about failed audits, negative quality events, we now think about, did they do something, or is there unsustainable or unacceptable levels of failed audits in a particular office or region? And we've just started pulling more people in to be held accountable. It doesn't just stop at the engagement team anymore.
Any other questions? Yes.
How do you tone at the top? It's probably a behavior question, but we've been having this conversation like we believe this is all happening in the United States, but we know it's not. It's a global network. You have cultures different around the world. If you peel this onion back, I think you may have been surprised at time to time about things that happen in different cultures. How are you really dealing with the culture issue, particularly tone at the top? You may think that tone at the top is perfect, but in that country, that tone may be different. So how do you, if you're going to be a global network, how are you handling that culture?
Mr. Global?
Well,
The other two were smiling.
yeah.
I'm like, yeah, what he said.
Yeah. So this may come as a surprise to most of you, but I'm only 25 years old. So, yeah, it's aging, and it's been it's an eye opener. It is an eye opener, and actually, it's kind of reinvigorated me towards the end of my career. Things that I think we take for granted here are not, just very culturally different. And the way we've been thinking about it and trying to work through it is just say, look, this is what it means to be at BDO these days. So it doesn't matter if you're in the U.S. or Thailand or Wakanda, wherever you are, there are standards that we have. And so you need to think about your own behaviors relative to this standard, not what the practices are locally. Our big challenge right now is knowing that this is coming, knowing that regulators are asking the firms that they regulate about how are things going in these countries, and we have to provide that to them. We are dealing with it now. We have rules like you can't unsee what you see. So when we do go in and we find something that just seems, when we question, I run into issues around work papers and some other things that people, just some of the questions that come back, you mean that's really wrong? Yeah, yes. So we are now dealing with that now, and what I'm also finding, again, I'd almost love to hear what goes on at the other firms, is we're dealing with it in a team way. So it's not just me calling up the managing partner in that particular location. We have regional CEOs, and we come together and say, this is what we found, this is not acceptable, this is why, fix it, and have consequences.
And I think when we look at the global landscape in terms of where the U.S. is relative to the rest of the world, we're years ahead of folks. And you think about the debate in the UK, and they can't seem to figure out that management's at fault a lot of the time along the way. But when you talk to folks and you look at some of the situations that you have, they are different. You want people to execute in the same way because it's a global network. And as Chris said, you read these things and people have trouble doing it. And people are all coming into us now on consultation matters. And you worry about legal liability now and the like, but we are buck stops here and trying to get people thinking the same way. It's a hard thing to do. And everybody's culture is different.
Yeah, definitely not a level playing field. I'm on our global method, I'm one of the global methodology leaders, and we meet, 4 times a year, but sometimes because we have a global methodology, sometimes when when we're talking about changing the methodology, tweaking it somewhat in the US, the partner that oversees the global network, he's like, no, because if we know you can do it right in the US, but I'm just making up I'm not but Kenya or just a more remote country, our methodology has to be written so that they know how to apply it too. So it gets a little frustrating sometimes, but it's because we have, it's just not a level playing field in terms of the various territories.
You ever see anybody get kicked off the island at some point?
Yeah, oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I think you've seen some of them.
I have. I just,
Yes.
I've been giving you a softball.
Yeah. Yes, they've been kicked off the island.
We can probably do one more question if we have one more question.
I'll just make a quick comment to that culture. There's research on culture as well that if you frame a paragraph of a standard one way for the U.S., the literature suggests how you should do it in a particular culture, maybe collectivist countries versus individual countries, that you can arrive at the same high quality judgment decision, you just have to simply frame it differently. So there's lots of research out there on that.
That's interesting because as we think about rolling out new software tools and like, and you talk about translation, there's more than literal translation. So Chris, I think that'd be very interesting, I think, for all of us to see. Okay. Send that over. It's accepted.
Okay, well, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you, Abe, Heidi, Dan, and Chris. Thank you so much for your time today. Really robust discussion, and thank you all for coming.